She started her day long before the sun fully rose, when most of the city was still wrapped in quiet and soft darkness. The streets were almost empty at that hour, with only a few early workers moving quickly toward buses or small shops opening their shutters. She walked through them with steady steps, holding a small bag close to her side, her uniform neatly folded inside. This was her routine, one she had followed for a long time, and even though her body often felt tired, her mind had learned how to stay focused. The restaurant where she worked was located in one of the calm, upscale parts of the city. It was not the kind of place that shouted for attention. Instead, it had a quiet charm, with warm lights, polished wooden floors, and soft background music that made everything feel slightly more elegant than the world outside. People came there to relax, to talk, and to enjoy meals without rush. For her, it was a place of work, responsibility, and silent observation. When she arrived, she always entered through the back door. The kitchen staff would already be preparing for the day, moving in organized chaos, checking ingredients, cleaning surfaces, and planning the flow of orders. She would greet them with a simple nod and a polite smile, then head straight to the small employee room. There, she changed into her uniform, tied her apron carefully, and looked at her reflection for a moment. She was not someone who sought attention. Her appearance was always simple and neat, shaped more by discipline than style. Her role was straightforward but never easy. She served tables, carried trays filled with carefully prepared dishes, and made sure every guest felt comfortable. The restaurant valued perfection, and even the smallest mistake could create pressure. She had learned how to move quickly without appearing rushed, how to balance multiple plates without shaking her hands, and how to keep a calm expression even during the busiest hours. Over time, she became reliable, someone the manager trusted without question. But despite her skill, she remained distant from others. The staff knew her as quiet, polite, and focused. She did not talk much during breaks, and she rarely joined conversations unless spoken to. Some thought she was shy. Others believed she simply preferred silence. No one really asked too much about her past, and she never offered explanations. She let her work speak for her. There was something else about her that most people never noticed. It was not something visible in the way she served food or cleaned tables. It was in the way her eyes sometimes lingered on things longer than necessary, especially when the restaurant was quiet. There was a corner in the dining hall where an old piano stood. It was placed there more as decoration than for actual use. The restaurant had never hired a musician to play it regularly, and over time, it became just part of the background, something people admired for its look but ignored in practice. Yet she noticed it every day. Whenever she passed by it, even for a few seconds, her gaze softened slightly. It was not obvious, not something anyone would question, but it was there, a quiet connection, like a memory that refused to fade completely. The restaurant had a habit of changing its mood throughout the day, almost like it had its own breathing rhythm. In the morning, it felt calm and structured, with staff moving in careful coordination as they prepared for the first guests. By afternoon, it became warmer and slightly more relaxed, with soft light spreading across the tables and chairs. But by evening, everything shifted again. The space turned elegant, polished, and full of quiet expectation, as if waiting for something important to happen at any moment. It was during one of these evenings that something inside the restaurant began to feel slightly different, though no one noticed it at first. The lights were dimmed just enough to create a cozy atmosphere. The scent of freshly prepared food mixed gently with the faint fragrance of flowers placed on each table. Soft music played from hidden speakers, blending into the background like a distant memory. She moved through this environment with her usual calm presence. Her apron was tied neatly, and her steps were steady and familiar. She carried plates carefully, making sure each dish reached the correct table without delay. Her focus was always on her work, but her awareness of the surroundings was sharp. She noticed everything, even things that others overlooked. That evening, something caught her attention again. It was not unusual, not at first glance, but it always had a quiet effect on her. The piano in the corner of the dining hall stood under soft light, its polished surface reflecting faint glimmers from the chandeliers above. It was an old instrument but well cared for. The wood still carried a deep shine, and the keys were neatly aligned, waiting patiently for someone to bring them to life. Most guests never looked at it for more than a second. To them, it was just decoration, something placed to give the restaurant a touch of elegance. But for her, it was different. Every time she passed by it, even in a busy rush, her gaze would slow slightly, not enough to stop her work, but enough to suggest that her mind was somewhere else for a brief moment. There was something about the piano that made her chest feel heavy in a way she could not explain easily. It was not sadness exactly. It was more like remembering something without fully seeing it. A feeling that sat quietly beneath everything else she did, never interfering, but never disappearing either. She had learned to hide it well. In a place like this, emotions were not meant to be visible. Guests expected smooth service, polite smiles, and perfect timing. And she gave them exactly that. Still, inside her, there was a part that always responded when she saw that instrument. That evening, the restaurant was hosting a group of guests who appeared well-dressed and confident. Their voices carried easily across the room, louder than others, as they discussed business, travel, and experiences in different parts of the world. They seemed used to attention, used to being heard, and they naturally filled the space around them. First, everything remained normal. Orders were taken, food was served, and conversations continued at different tables. She moved between them with practiced ease, balancing trays, adjusting plates, and ensuring that every detail met the restaurant's standard. But as the evening progressed, something subtle began to shift in one of the larger tables near the center. A few guests there started commenting on the atmosphere, suggesting that the restaurant felt too quiet for a place that claimed to offer a premium experience. Their tone was not aggressive, but it carried a sense of superiority, as if they expected more entertainment, more excitement, more control over their surroundings. One of them glanced toward the piano and made a casual remark about how it looked impressive but unused. Another responded with a slight laugh, saying it was probably just there for decoration. The conversation continued lightly, but there was an underlying sense of dismissal, as if the instrument itself had no real value. She happened to be nearby when these comments were made. She did not react outwardly, but she heard every word clearly. She continued her work, placing a plate carefully on the table next to them, maintaining her calm expression. However, something inside her tightened slightly, though she did not let it show. The group continued speaking, and their attention slowly shifted toward the staff. One of them made a passing remark, questioning whether anyone in the restaurant could even play the piano properly. It was said in a joking tone, but it carried a subtle challenge, the kind that does not demand an answer directly but still expects one. A few of them laughed, looking around the room as if waiting for a response. Their eyes briefly passed over different staff members, including her, without any real expectation. To them, she was just a waitress, part of the background service, someone who brought food and cleared tables. She did not respond. She finished placing the order and turned away as if nothing had been said. But the moment stayed with her longer than expected. As she walked back toward the service counter, her steps slowed slightly. Not enough for anyone to notice, but enough for her own awareness to catch the change. She passed near the piano again, and this time, her gaze lingered a little longer than before. The reflection of the room lights shimmered on its surface, almost as if it was waiting silently for something unspoken. For a brief moment she stopped. It was not a decision made quickly. It felt more like something inside her paused first, before her body followed. She stood there for a second, holding an empty tray, looking at the piano without moving. The restaurant continued around her. Plates clinked softly, voices blended, and footsteps moved across the floor. But in her mind, everything felt slightly distant. She remembered something she had not allowed herself to think about in a long time. Not in detail, not fully formed, but enough to create a feeling she could not ignore. A memory of sound, of rhythm, of something once familiar that had slowly disappeared from her life. She blinked once, then turned away and continued walking. No one noticed the pause. To everyone else, it was just another moment in a busy evening. But for her, it stayed longer than it should have. Later that night, as she continued serving tables, she felt a quiet tension building inside her. Not discomfort, but something closer to awareness. The kind of feeling that arrives slowly, like a thought forming in the background of a busy mind. She began to notice the piano more frequently. Not because it had changed, but because her attention kept returning to it. Each time she passed by, it felt slightly more present, as if it was no longer just part of the decoration but something waiting to be acknowledged. She did not understand why this feeling was growing stronger. She had spent years keeping it controlled, locked away behind routine and responsibility. Yet tonight it felt slightly harder to ignore. Meanwhile, the restaurant continued to move forward in its usual rhythm. Guests laughed, ordered more food, and enjoyed their evening without concern. Staff members worked efficiently, unaware of the quiet shift happening in one corner of the room. She finished another round of service and stood briefly near the counter, adjusting her apron. Her hands were steady, but her thoughts were not entirely focused on her work anymore. They kept drifting back to the same point in the room. The piano. It stood there, unchanged, untouched, and silent. But to her, it no longer felt like just an object. It felt like something that had been waiting for a long time without complaint. And for the first time that evening, she allowed herself to wonder something she had avoided for years. What would it feel like to hear it again? The thought passed quickly, almost immediately pushed aside by responsibility. She picked up her tray and returned to her duties. But something had already shifted, even if only slightly, deep within her awareness. The night continued, but the silence around the piano no longer felt empty. The evening had already settled deeply into the restaurant, and the atmosphere inside felt more refined than earlier in the day. The soft lighting reflected gently off the polished tables, and the quiet background music mixed with the sound of plates and soft footsteps created a calm rhythm throughout the room. Guests were now fully engaged in their meals and conversations, and the staff moved smoothly between tables, keeping everything in order. She continued her work as usual, moving carefully from one table to another. Her hands were steady, her expressions controlled, and her focus sharp. Nothing about her outward behavior suggested anything unusual. To anyone watching, she was simply doing her job with quiet efficiency, just like she always did. But inside the restaurant, not everything remained calm for long. At one of the larger tables near the center, a group of guests had settled in for the evening. They were dressed well, speaking confidently, and seemed comfortable drawing attention to themselves. Their conversation started off normal, talking about travel experiences and different cities they had visited. But slowly, the tone began to change. It began with small comments, nothing loud or directly harmful at first. One of them mentioned how the restaurant looked elegant but felt a bit too quiet. Another added that places like this often rely more on appearance than real entertainment. A few light laughs followed, but there was a clear sense that they were trying to impress each other with their opinions. She was nearby when she heard it, clearing a table not too far away. She did not react. She had learned long ago how to stay composed in situations like this. She simply continued her work, collecting empty plates and arranging them neatly on her tray. However, the conversation at that table did not stop there. One of the guests glanced around the room, observing the surroundings with a slightly critical expression. His eyes moved across the dining hall, briefly stopping on the piano placed in the corner. It stood under soft lighting, untouched and still, like it always was. He leaned slightly forward and made a casual remark, suggesting that the piano looked impressive but probably had no real use. Another guest responded with a smile, saying it was likely just for decoration, placed there to give the restaurant a fancy feeling. Their tone was light, but the words carried a subtle dismissiveness. A few others at the table laughed. The conversation continued, and slowly, it shifted toward a more direct challenge. One of them said something along the lines of how many places like this claim to have live music but rarely have anyone who can actually play well. The comment was followed by another laugh, and then silence for a brief moment, as if they were expecting someone in the room to respond. She happened to be passing by again at that moment. She slowed slightly when she heard the words, but she did not stop. She placed a dish carefully on a nearby table and turned away, maintaining her usual calm expression. Her reaction was controlled, but inside, something stirred quietly. Not anger, not frustration, but a small shift in awareness that she did not fully acknowledge. The group at the center table continued speaking, now slightly louder, as if encouraged by their own conversation. One of them glanced around again and made a joking comment about how even a simple tune would probably sound better than silence. Another added that it would be interesting if someone in the restaurant could actually play something worth listening to. Their eyes briefly scanned the room, passing over staff members and guests, as if searching for a response or reaction. When their gaze moved across her, it did not linger. To them, she was just part of the service staff, someone who brought food and moved quietly through the background. But something in their words stayed in the air longer than expected. She continued working, but her steps became slightly more measured. She moved with the same professionalism, but there was a subtle shift in her awareness. The piano in the corner, which had always been present but ignored, now felt more noticeable than before. It was not just an object anymore. It felt like a presence that had been quietly listening to everything around it. As she passed near it again while serving another table, she felt a strange pull in her attention. It was not strong enough to stop her completely, but it was enough to make her slow down for a brief second. Her eyes moved toward the piano keys, then quickly away again, as if she was reminding herself of something. She finished her task and returned to the service counter, placing her tray down carefully. Her hands were steady, but her thoughts were no longer fully focused on the room around her. The conversation at the central table continued. The guests seemed to enjoy their own amusement now, feeding off each other's comments. They were not trying to be cruel in an obvious way, but their words carried a kind of careless confidence that often came from people who were used to being listened to. One of them leaned back in his chair and made another remark about how a place like this should have more life. Someone else responded by saying that even a simple melody could improve the entire atmosphere. There was laughter again, and a few glances toward the piano. She noticed all of it, even while continuing her tasks. At one point, one of the guests raised his voice slightly and said something that drew attention from nearby tables. He commented that it would be amusing if someone unexpected stepped forward and played the piano. The way he said it suggested he did not believe it would happen, but the idea itself was presented like a challenge wrapped in humor. A few people around him smiled or shook their heads. Some ignored it completely and continued their meals. But the idea had already been planted in the atmosphere, even if no one said it out loud again. She returned to clearing another table, her movements smooth and practiced. Yet her mind was no longer as quiet as before. The piano, the comments, the laughter, they all seemed to connect in a way that was slowly forming something inside her awareness. She did not respond to the guests. She never did. That was not her place in the restaurant. Her role was service, not participation in conversations. Still, something about this evening felt different. As she stood near the service area for a moment, she glanced across the room again. The piano remained untouched, sitting in its corner like it always did. But now it felt slightly more present, as if it had become part of the conversation without speaking. She quickly looked away and picked up her tray again. Meanwhile, the guests at the central table were finishing their meals. Their energy was still high, their conversation still active. One of them made a final passing comment about how silence in a place like this sometimes felt unnecessary, as if the room itself was waiting for something. And then, almost casually, another guest repeated the earlier idea about someone playing the piano. It was said lightly, almost like a joke, but this time it carried a slightly longer pause afterward. That pause mattered more than the words themselves. She heard it clearly as she passed nearby. And for the first time that evening, she did not immediately push the thought away. Instead, she continued walking, but her steps were slower than before, and her attention was no longer fully anchored to her routine. The restaurant carried on, unaware of the small shift beginning to form inside her, as the piano in the corner remained silent, waiting without expectation, but no longer unnoticed. She did not notice the exact moment when the decision formed inside her mind. It was not sudden and it was not loud. It came quietly, like a thought that had been waiting for the right space to appear. The restaurant was still busy, still filled with voices, movement, and the soft rhythm of service, but something within her had started to feel slightly different. She continued her work as if nothing had changed. That was what she always did. Plates were still carried, tables were still cleaned, and guests were still attended to with the same calm attention. Her hands moved with habit, and her expression stayed composed. From the outside, everything about her looked exactly the same as before. But inside, there was a small shift that she could not fully ignore anymore. The comments from earlier still lingered in her thoughts. Not because they were important, but because they had touched something she had kept carefully quiet for a long time. It was not about pride or attention. It was something deeper, something connected to a part of her life that she had left behind without fully saying goodbye to it. She passed near the piano again while moving between tables. It stood in its usual place, silent and untouched, reflecting the warm light from above. For a brief moment, she slowed her steps. Her eyes rested on it longer than before. Not just a passing glance, but a moment of stillness in motion. Then she looked away and continued walking. The restaurant was reaching one of its busier phases of the evening. Orders were coming in faster, and the staff was moving with increased focus. She was needed at several tables, and her attention was divided between tasks. Yet even in the middle of this busy flow, the piano kept returning to her mind, not as a distraction, but as a quiet presence she could not fully push away. At one of the tables near the center, the group of guests who had been speaking earlier was still there. Their meal was mostly finished now, and their conversation had become more relaxed. They were leaning back in their chairs, drinking slowly, and continuing their discussion with the same confident tone. Every now and then, one of them would glance toward the piano again. It was not serious, not direct, but there was still that sense of curiosity mixed with casual challenge. One of them even repeated the idea of how unusual it was that such an elegant instrument remained unused in a place like this. She heard it again as she passed by. This time, she did not immediately move away in her mind. She kept walking, but her awareness stayed slightly longer on the thought than before. It was subtle, almost invisible from the outside, but inside her, it stayed just a little longer than it should have. She finished serving another table and returned briefly to the service counter. She placed her tray down and adjusted her apron. Her movements were normal, practiced, almost automatic. But her thoughts were not fully aligned with her actions anymore. She looked across the room without meaning to. The piano was still there, still waiting, still silent. Something inside her tightened slightly, not in discomfort, but in recognition. It was not about the guests anymore. Their words had faded into the background. What remained was something else entirely. A feeling she had avoided acknowledging for a long time. A memory that did not arrive as a full picture, but as fragments of sound, rhythm, and emotion that she could not fully ignore. She took a slow breath and turned back to her work. But the shift had already begun. As the evening continued, the atmosphere in the restaurant remained steady, but her attention started to change in small ways. She still performed every task correctly, still responded to guests with the same professionalism. But there were brief moments where her focus drifted for a fraction of a second longer than usual. It was always the same direction, the piano. At one point, while passing near it again, she slowed more noticeably than before. This time, she did not immediately correct herself. She stopped for a brief second, standing just within a few steps of the instrument. Her eyes moved across its surface. The polished wood, the closed lid, the stillness of it all. It looked like it had not been disturbed for a long time. Yet it did not feel empty to her. It felt like something that had been waiting patiently without complaint. Behind her, the restaurant continued its rhythm. Plates were being cleared, conversations were continuing, and footsteps moved across the floor. No one paid attention to her pause. It was too small, too quiet to notice. She eventually moved again, continuing her work. But that moment stayed with her longer than she expected. Back at the central table, the group of guests had now finished their main course. Their voices were softer, but still active. One of them leaned forward slightly and made another passing comment about how silence in a place like this sometimes felt heavier than sound. Another responded by saying that places like this should always have something that fills the space, something more than just background noise. The piano was mentioned again, not directly at her, but in general conversation. Someone said it would be interesting if someone actually played it. Not seriously, just as an idea, like something unlikely but entertaining to imagine. There was a brief laugh, and then the conversation moved on. But this time something was different. She had heard enough. It was not anger that rose inside her. It was not frustration either. It was something quieter, more internal. A feeling that had been forming slowly throughout the evening, now finally reaching a point where it could not stay completely hidden. She finished her current task and returned to the service area. She placed her tray down carefully and stood still for a moment longer than usual. Her eyes were not focused on anything specific. For the first time that evening, she was not immediately moving on to the next task. The restaurant around her did not stop. Everything continued as normal. But inside her, a decision had started to take shape without words. She looked toward the piano again. This time, her gaze did not move away quickly. She stayed there for a few seconds, long enough to feel the weight of everything she had avoided thinking about, long enough to hear the quiet memory of something she had once known very well, even if she had left it behind. Her fingers tightened slightly at her side, not enough for anyone to notice, but enough for her to feel it herself. She glanced briefly at the guests, then back at the piano, and then, without announcing anything, without asking for permission, she slowly stepped away from the service area. It was a small movement, just a few steps at first, but it was different from everything she had done that evening. This was not part of her routine. As she walked, her pace was steady but no longer automatic. Each step felt slightly more deliberate. The restaurant seemed to grow quieter in her awareness, even though nothing around her had actually changed. She moved closer to the corner where the piano stood. No one stopped her. No one even noticed immediately. She reached it and stood in front of it. For a moment she did not sit. She simply looked at it. The silence around her felt different now. Not empty, but full of something unspoken. Behind her, the restaurant continued its usual rhythm, unaware that something was about to change in a way no one had expected. She stood in front of the piano without moving for a few seconds. The restaurant continued around her as if nothing unusual was happening. Waiters passed by carrying trays, soft conversations filled the tables, and the gentle sound of cutlery touching plates created a steady background rhythm. Everything looked normal from the outside, but for her it was not normal anymore. The piano was right in front of her, silent and still, like it had always been. Its polished surface reflected the warm lights of the restaurant, and its keys waited quietly under the closed lid. It had been sitting there for years, seen by hundreds of guests, but touched by almost none. Now it felt different. She slowly placed her hand on the edge of it, not pressing any key yet, just feeling the surface. Her fingers moved gently, as if she was confirming that it was real. The wood felt smooth and familiar in a way she could not explain in words. For a brief moment, her mind drifted back without permission. Not as a full memory but as fragments. A distant sound. A feeling of rhythm. A sense of time flowing differently. She closed her eyes slightly, then opened them again. Behind her, the restaurant continued to function. No one had stopped to watch her yet. The group of guests who had made earlier comments were still sitting at their table, talking among themselves. Their attention was not focused on her at that exact moment. She took a slow breath. Then she moved. She stepped closer to the piano bench and sat down. It was a simple action, but it changed the atmosphere for her immediately. Sitting there felt like stepping into a place she had not visited for a long time. Her posture was steady, but her hands hesitated slightly above the keys. For a few seconds, she did nothing. The restaurant noise continued around her, but it felt more distant now. Her focus narrowed down to the instrument in front of her. The keys were clean, aligned, waiting. She placed her fingers gently on them. Still silence. A moment passed. Then, softly, she pressed the first note. It was quiet at first, almost delicate, barely noticeable to the room, just a single sound entering the air and slowly fading into it. But it was enough to change something inside her. She pressed another key, then another. The notes began to form a pattern, slow, careful, and controlled. At first, it sounded simple, almost like she was testing the instrument, reconnecting with something forgotten. Her fingers moved cautiously, as if remembering the path rather than creating it. A few nearby guests started to notice. One table turned slightly in curiosity. A conversation paused for a second before continuing softly again. But most people still did not fully understand what was happening. She continued playing. The music grew slightly more confident. The hesitation in her hands began to fade. Her fingers moved with more familiarity now, as if the piano was responding to something already inside her. The sound was still gentle, but it carried emotion. Not loud or dramatic, but deep and steady. It filled the space slowly, spreading from the corner of the room into the rest of the restaurant. More heads began to turn. The group of guests who had made earlier comments finally noticed her properly. At first, they looked surprised. They had not expected her to sit there. There was a brief exchange of glances among them, as if they were trying to understand what was happening. She did not look at them. Her focus remained completely on the piano. Her hands moved more freely now. The music was no longer just simple notes. It began to carry flow, rhythm, and structure. The melody started to grow deeper, more expressive. Each note connected naturally with the next, like a conversation without words. The restaurant atmosphere slowly began to change. People stopped talking. Some guests lowered their cutlery without realizing it. Others turned fully toward the piano, their attention now completely drawn to the sound filling the room. She continued playing. Her expression remained calm, but something inside her had shifted fully now. It was not hesitation anymore. It was release, like something locked away for a long time had finally found space to exist again. The music became richer. It was still controlled, but now it had emotion layered into it. There were moments of softness, followed by slightly stronger notes that carried depth and feeling. It was not just performance. It felt like expression. The room grew quieter. Even the staff, who had been busy moments ago, started to slow down. Some stood still near their stations, listening without speaking. Others paused mid-task, unable to ignore the sound that had taken over the space. She did not look up. Her world had narrowed completely to the piano. Her fingers moved with increasing confidence, as if memory was guiding them more than thought. The music flowed more naturally now, without hesitation. It was no longer something she was trying to remember. It was something returning on its own. A few guests at nearby tables turned fully in their seats now, openly watching. Their expressions changed from curiosity to surprise. Some looked impressed, others quietly shocked. The earlier casual atmosphere of the restaurant had disappeared. The group of guests who had spoken earlier now sat in silence. Their confident expressions had faded. They were no longer joking or laughing. Instead, they were watching with a kind of disbelief that slowly turned into respect. She continued playing. The melody reached a slightly stronger phase. Not loud or overwhelming, but more expressive, carrying emotional depth that was impossible to ignore. The notes rose and fell with natural flow, creating a sense of movement that filled the entire room. The restaurant was now completely quiet except for the piano. Even conversations at distant tables had stopped. No one was speaking. Everyone was listening. She remained focused. Her posture was steady, her movements smooth. There was no hesitation left in her hands. It was as if something inside her had fully aligned with the music. For the first time that evening, she was not just serving in the background. She was at the center of everything. The melody shifted again, becoming slightly more emotional. It was still controlled, but now it carried a deeper feeling, something that could not be easily described. It was not sadness or happiness alone. It was something in between, something layered and human. The guests continued to watch. Some leaned forward slightly. Others sat still, completely focused. Even those who had earlier dismissed the piano were now silent, unable to look away. She kept playing. Her fingers moved with steady rhythm, and the sound filled every corner of the restaurant. It reflected off the walls, floated above the tables, and settled into the silence of the room. There was no interruption. No one spoke. Only music remained. And in that moment, the entire restaurant was no longer just a dining space. It had become something else entirely, held together by a single performance that no one had expected, and no one could ignore. The restaurant had never felt so silent before. Even though it was still full of people, it felt as if time itself had slowed down. The soft clinking of plates had stopped. Conversations had disappeared. Even the movement of staff seemed quieter, as if everyone was careful not to break the moment that had taken over the room. She was still sitting at the piano. Her fingers continued to move gently over the keys, shaping the final part of the melody. The music had already reached its most emotional point. It was no longer just sound filling the space. It felt like something deeper, something that touched the room in a way words could not explain. Each note carried meaning. Each pause carried feeling. And slowly, the music began to soften. Her hands moved with steady control, but now there was a sense of closure in her rhythm. The intensity was slowly fading, like a wave returning to the sea after reaching the shore. The melody was coming to an end. Around her, people were still completely silent. Some guests sat with their hands frozen above their tables, unable to continue eating. Others leaned slightly forward, as if afraid to miss even a single moment of the sound. A few simply stared. Their expressions changed from curiosity to deep respect. The group of guests who had spoken earlier were no longer speaking at all. Their confident attitude had completely disappeared. They looked different now, quieter, more thoughtful. One of them lowered his gaze slightly, as if realizing something unspoken. The playful tone they had carried earlier in the evening no longer existed. She did not look at anyone. Her focus remained on the piano. Her final notes were approaching. The melody slowed even more. Each key press became softer, more spaced out. The room seemed to hold its breath with every sound. And then it happened. She pressed the final note. It was soft, gentle. It lingered in the air longer than the others, slowly fading into silence. And then, there was nothing. Complete silence. For a few seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. The restaurant was still, as if the entire space was waiting to understand what had just happened. She kept her hands resting lightly on the keys. Her head lowered slightly, as if she was still inside the music even after it had ended. She did not rush to stand. She did not look for attention. She simply stayed there for a moment, quietly breathing. Then, slowly, she lifted her hands away from the piano. The silence continued. It felt heavier now, not empty, but full of something unspoken. Then one sound broke it. A single clap came from somewhere in the room. Just one person at first. Then another. And then another. Within seconds, the silence transformed. Applause began to spread across the restaurant. First it was soft, respectful, but quickly it grew stronger. More people joined in. Tables that had been frozen moments ago were now filled with clapping hands. The sound filled the space where music had just been. She finally lifted her head. For the first time that evening, she looked around the room. The applause was not loud in a chaotic way. It was steady, sincere. A genuine response from people who had just experienced something unexpected and powerful. Some guests were smiling. Others still looked slightly emotional, as if they were processing what they had just heard. A few simply continued clapping with quiet admiration. She remained seated for a moment longer. Her expression stayed calm, but there was something different in her eyes now. Not pride, not surprise, something quieter. A feeling of release. Slowly, she stood up from the piano bench. The applause continued. She turned slightly, facing the room, but did not bow dramatically or seek attention. She simply acknowledged the moment with a small, respectful pause, then stepped back from the piano. As she moved away, the sound in the room slowly began to settle. The applause did not stop immediately, but it softened gradually, as if the energy of the moment was slowly calming down. She walked back toward the service area. Her apron was still on. Her uniform still simple. But something about how people looked at her had changed. Earlier in the evening, she had been just a waitress to most of them. Someone who served tables quietly, without drawing attention. Now she was something else in their eyes. As she passed between tables, a few guests looked at her with quiet admiration. Some nodded slightly in respect. Others simply watched her move, still processing what they had witnessed. She did not stop. She did not seek reactions. She returned to her place near the service counter and stood there for a moment. Behind her, the restaurant slowly returned to life. Conversations started again. But they were different now. Softer, slower, more thoughtful. The energy had changed permanently. The group of guests who had spoken earlier remained quiet for a while. One of them eventually said something softly to the others, but their tone had completely changed. There was no laughter now, only reflection. One of them glanced again toward the piano, then back toward her. There was no challenge in his expression anymore, only realization. She continued her work. She picked up her tray again and moved toward another table. Her steps were steady just like before, but now, every movement felt slightly different in the eyes of those watching her. She was still the same person who had served them earlier. But something about her had become unforgettable. The piano stood silent again in its corner. But it no longer felt like decoration. Felt like something that had just spoken. And she, quietly moving through the restaurant once more, returned to her role as if nothing had changed, even though everything in the room had.